Got my 23-year FBI ring on. I got my FBI badge here. So, we're good. I would say that I've probably worked on anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 homicide cases. But this is a really different type of homicide case. It's an unusual homicide with a lot of sexual overtones to it. With the sex toy and with the videotape, with so many twists and sort of turns in it.
I handed them the tape. They said, "What's on this?" I said, "I don't know."
I wasn't trying to kill you, okay?
What do you call strangling someone?
Police, fire, or medical aid?
Emergency. I think my wife just was murdered.
Are you at the house where your wife is now?
Yes.
Okay, and what's going on with her?
She is laying on the couch, not moving. She's cold, no heart, no pulse.
Daniel Carlson tells dispatch, "I think my wife has been murdered." 911 is sending police officers during the call.
Is there any obvious signs of injury or anything?
Yeah, she's been stabbed or shot. There's blood all over the place.
And you do not think she can be resuscitated?
I'm a nurse. I'm freaking out here.
In this area of Washington, it's heavily forested, is very rural. Responding patrol officers are trying to figure out which of these houses off in the woods is the house that we're supposed to be going to. When they eventually find this residence, they see a man standing in the doorway, still on the phone with dispatch.
Sir, your last name?
Carlson?
And your first name?
Daniel?
Daniel Carlson is the husband of Lisa Carlson. She's 27 years old. They go into the house. The front door actually enters into the living room. So right in front of the deputies is Lisa. The scene is pretty gruesome. She's dead, and she's been dead for a while.
You can't go in and let emotions take over. You've got a job to do. She is on her back, and there's blood on her person. She was lying on a pillow with a lot of blood on it. She has 2 gunshot wounds to the head, and she has 1 gunshot wound to the left side of her chest. These 2 shots to the head would have been incapacitating immediately.
There were 3 shots into Lisa from a .22. But there's no .22 at the crime scene. And when the police look at the scene where Lisa is, they come upon something rather unusual. They notice there's a TV, and it's on. In the VCR, detectives find a pornographic tape. But there's something else. Underneath the blanket, in Lisa's left hand, is a remote. 2 wires go to a vibrating sex toy. This is a very, very unusual scene.
Below her blanket, her trousers that she was wearing was pulled down, and she was nude.
It is not a position anybody would want to be found in by somebody else, alive or deceased. When they get into the master bedroom, there are drawers pulled out. There's quite a bit of disturbance within the bathroom. It looks like this might have been a robbery. Overall, it looks like Lisa laid on the couch, engaging in masturbatory activity, while somebody came in with a gun and shot her. Did they kill her in order to steal property? Are they searching for something in particular? What's the motive for killing Lisa?
My name's Sean McKillop. There were a lot of good memories growing up with Dan. We actually met in what was called 6th grade camp. Then for a couple of years after high school, he introduced his wife. Lisa was a lot of fun. She was funny. She was incredibly kind. Dan and Lisa met in nursing school, and that's where they ultimately got together, started dating.
They seemed to have somewhat very different personalities. Lisa was described by some people as being confident, somebody who would speak up. She was very outgoing.
Dan is very reserved. Until you get to know him, he's very quiet. Not to be too cruel about it, but we were virtually convinced that Dan was going to die a virgin.
It seemed to be a matter of opposites attract in terms of personality.
Lisa was an absolutely gorgeous woman, and the fact that Dan found Lisa and Lisa fell in love with him, I was amazed beyond words, but I was incredibly happy for him.
In 1995, they had twin boys.
From what I saw, he was a good father. I mean, he was a little unattentive, but also he was working, which meant he was out of the house at least 12 hours a day. Lisa, after having the children, had decided to become a stay-at-home mom. When raising her children, that was her job, and she went into it wholeheartedly.
It's approximately 01:23 hours. We are in front of Mr. Carlson's residence.
Detectives begin interviewing Dan in the back of a patrol car, trying to understand what happened. And what he explains is that he was at work and he got a call from his mother, Carol Carlson.
And so then you talked to your mom, and what did your mom tell you?
My mom told me that my two children, who were 3 years old, had walked up to my parents' house with no mommy when Lisa wasn't inside.
Parents live almost next door.
It's next door. I'd say it was 150 yards.
The two 3-year-olds could have been at the house at the same time as the murder of their mother.
Given the way she was found and the position she was in, it would just be horrifying to think of what they had witnessed.
Inside the residence, it looks like this might have been a robbery. The scene looks like there's been a ransacking going on, like somebody was in here searching, potentially for valuables.
But when you look at the scene, something ain't right.
Go into the office. This is the room that has the most valuable items in it. Computer, stereo, nothing's missing. Nothing's taken. And the bathroom's completely disheveled. Is the bathroom a good area to search for items for financial gain? Somebody murdered Lisa and then didn't take anything? It didn't make any sense.
When you entered the residence, what did you see?
I seen the living room was scattered with children's toys.
Police officers start to delve deeper into the relationship dynamic between Lisa and Dan.
What I'd like to do is describe the relationship that you and your wife, Lisa, have had for the last year and a half, 2 years.
Our personal relationship is we were still living together, but that's about it. The last year and a half, 2 years, Lisa started seeing another guy who she met through me. He was an old high school friend, Sean McKillop.
When the police finally showed up, I said, well, come on in. I've been expecting you.
"27-year-old Lisa Carlson was found shot to death on her living room couch. Police say the woman's husband came home from work and says he discovered the body. There were no indications of a struggle.
This is not your average homicide case. Why had Lisa allowed herself to be injured fatally without taking any kind of action to defend herself? Whoever was in the room firing those shots was not somebody that Lisa thought was going to be a threat to her safety until it was too late. Police now are considering Lisa's boyfriend, Sean McKillop, as a potential suspect in this. So they interview him.
Sean, specifically, we're talking about your relationship with Lisa.
How would you characterize your relationship with her?
I finally had found a woman that trusted me, believed in me, could understand my flaws and not judge me. She was perfect.
Okay. You were more than friends, were you lovers?
Oh, most definitely.
And then Sean tells the police, she was here yesterday at my place.
She came to your place in the morning on July the 18th, is that correct?
Yes,
Okay, so you guys had sexual contact.
most definitely.
She has told you that she intends to divorce Dan at some point, is
Yes.
that correct? Okay. When was the last time she mentioned that to you?
That she wanted to divorce him?
Mm-hmm.
Yesterday.
Police learned that Dan and Lisa, after they had twin boys, they were starting to have some financial pressures. Now they are trying to diaper and feed and take care of these two little ones on one person's salary.
Money was tight already, and then Dan, from what I understand, would go gambling, and he rarely did well. Their credit cards have been maxed out. It broke them financially.
It was really reaching kind of a crisis. And so Dan's parents, Carol and Daryl, strongly encouraged them to move out to where they were.
Dan's family had several acres they lived on. It was very isolated.
Dan was all for it. Lisa was dead set against it. Lisa didn't like Dan's mother, Carol. Carol creeped her out. She thought Carol was controlling.
Lisa felt that Carol disapproved of her in many ways. Lisa is isolated, and the relationship between Dan and Lisa is deteriorating more and more.
Eventually, they just stopped talking. Lisa grew incredibly lonely. I became a lifeline to her. I became a tender ear for her to reach out to talk. In this one particular instance, I go get a couple drinks, and a couple drinks led to a couple more. The next morning, we kind of wake up and went, oh. wasn't anything we set out to do. It just materialized.
I think on the surface it looks odd, right? Dan's best friend is telling officers he's romantically and sexually involved with his wife, and that his wife spends many nights over at his house.
When did she leave your residence?
She drove away somewhere between 12:35, 12:40.
And what kind of spirit was she in?
She was in the best mood I've seen her in probably 2-3 weeks. All smiles, she was happy. I love you, I miss you, I'll see you soon. My God, everything was just perfect.
Detectives are good at determining, is that real emotion we're seeing, or is this like put up emotion, phony emotion? But clearly for Sean, he was devastated by Lisa's death. That's the kind of reaction that you would expect from somebody who is emotionally, physically involved with somebody else as a love interest. But not only that, he is able to offer to the police lots of these chat logs that he has on his computer. Sean was ruled out as a suspect. Where do we go with this now? Daniel Carlson says, hey, I was at work. I've come home. I found my wife on the couch. She's been murdered. But his mom, Carol, was at home all day. So she would have been 100 yards away from the trailer. So detectives want to interview her.
We're taking a taped statement from Carol Jean Carlson. Do you recall the last time you saw Lisa Carlson?
It's been a while.
Did you see her at all on Saturday, July 18th of this year?
No, I didn't.
The first thing that they notice is Carol's very nervous. She seems apprehensive.
When police talk to Carol about the events of that day, she tells them that she's at her house and her 3-year-old grandsons show up at her house without their mom.
How'd they get up to your house?
They walked.
What'd the boys say when they came to your house?
I asked them where their mommy was, and they said that she was sleeping.
Seeping?
Sleeping.
And that's their term for sleep?
Sleeping.
Carol said, well, this was dangerous for them to come up by themselves. So I'm gonna call Lisa. So she called, says she called, gets the answering machine, leaves a message like, are you okay? What's going on?
Lisa, answer the phone. Your kids are up here. They've been up here for a couple minutes. Come on, wake up. Damn it.
Lisa's home is like 100 yards down the road. Why don't you just walk the boys back to find out what was going on with Lisa? And Carol's like, no, I don't go down there. We have a big problem with Lisa.
Carol was very loving and very kind, unless you didn't do exactly as she wanted. And if you didn't do exactly as she wanted, she was prone to punishment to make you fall into line. She was worse than a mother-in-law from hell.
You have this hostile relationship, really, between Lisa and Carol. I think that Carol took some perverse pleasure out of rattling Lisa.
First time I met Carol was high school. She appeared mousy, very plain, but she had some, I'll call them questionable views on women. If you wore makeup, if you wore perfume, you were not a good person. whether you were married or not, if you engaged in intercourse for any reason other than expressly to have children, you were a lesser human being. Carol really tried to come in and influence and control how Lisa was going to raise her children.
Carol often referred to her grandchildren as her babies, almost like they're hers. Perhaps Carol saw her more as a rival than as a daughter-in-law.
Lisa flat out told her, "These are my children. I will raise them as I see fit." Carol did not like that. Lisa would be taking a nap, and she'd wake up and Carol's inside her house snooping around. There was more than one occasion where Carol had let herself in, and Lisa was in the shower. And she was like, "Get the hell out of my house."
How would you describe your relationship with Lisa?
Not outstanding. We hardly speak at all.
And what's the problem? Did you ever have a falling out?
Oh, yeah.
What detectives learn is that about 5 months earlier, when Lisa and Dan were estranged in their relationship, deputies had been at the house for an assault on Lisa.
At this point, Lisa and I are in a relationship. Dan was away, and we're having a good time, just hanging out. And Dan's parents, Carol and Daryl, had come home from work. Carol is banging on the front door. Carol is just having a screaming fit with Lisa.
Detectives learned that Carol says Lisa is a terrible mother, horrible human being. She called her a whore.
She's expecting to see two people undressed having sex. And she goes over and that's not the case.
She had an incredible temper. She took on an almost reptilian type of personality. It was just cold behind the eyes. Ultimately, she left. But about 10, 15 minutes after that, there was another pounding on the door. Lisa opens the door, and it's not Carol, it's Dan's father, Daryl. He immediately rushes in, he grabs Lisa, and he throws her to the floor.
And because of that, she called the police. Daryl was arrested, taken off in handcuffs.
This undercurrent of abuse seems to be escalating. What we're seeing now is violence directed from Dan's parents to Lisa.
One thing we have to look for is who has an alibi, who doesn't, right? So they looked at Daryl. But Daryl actually has an alibi. At the time of Lisa's murder, he's at work. Well documented, he was there. So he clearly isn't involved in this. And Carol says she was at home all day.
You know who killed Lisa Carlson?
No, I do not.
You involved in her death in any fashion?
No, I'm not.
And she left messages on the answering machine, hoping Lisa will wake up.
Lisa, your kids are up here. Come on, wake up.
We know how it happened. We know when it happened, and determining the who is the big one. We need forensic evidence. Evidence never lies. People can lie, but the evidence never lies. I was brought in to interpret the blood patterns in the house. where Lisa Carlson's body was found. Looking at the blood pattern on the wall, little tiny specks of blood, there was enough blood there to tell a story. We used a model and put her on the couch, put labels on her head like red entrance wounds, and we were able to show that Lisa Carlson was seated at one end of the couch when she was shot.
But that's not where we find her. How does that happen?
There is a transfer of wet hair, wet with blood, that leads like a trail from where she was shot to a position on the couch where she was found.
So that means that she was moved. Somebody puts their bloody hand on the couch, anchoring themselves while they're grabbing Lisa and pulling her up the couch.
When we looked at her clothing, she had no underpants on, but yet her trousers that she was wearing was pulled down and turned inside out and not pulled down by herself.
Why would somebody pull her sweatpants down and expose her genital area? And then with the sex toy and with the videotape, all of this tells us that this was staged. It wasn't enough to kill her. Somebody wanted to humiliate her, even in death. Because of the relationship that Lisa had with this boyfriend, Sean McKillop, when Sean was interviewed, he told the police something very important. Lisa gave me this tape.
They said, "What's on this?" I said, "I don't know." Lisa said, "Hold on to it, and if anything happened, to give it to you."
When Sean learned that Lisa had been murdered, he told police, "Look, Lisa told me that if something happened to her, she gave me this tape."
Well, the first thing I would like to know is why you tried to just kill me.
I didn't try to kill you.
What do you call strangling someone now?
I wasn't trying to kill you. Okay?
Well, God, I mean, you grabbed me around my neck, okay?
Yes, I did. It wasn't putting pressure to do things.
What was on the tape was Lisa having surreptitiously recorded Dan admitting to strangling her.
It's astonishing to think that this person has just done these things and yet does not seem at all concerned or remorseful or guilty.
What I am interested in is that the safety of me and my children.
The children have nothing to worry about.
If you're gonna do it to me, how long is it gonna be before they get the same treatment now? Do I abuse you in front of the children?
No, you don't.
Physically or mentally?
I said you don't.
Do you?
Yes.
Lisa was really, I think, in fear of her life. She was actively trying to gather evidence in case she did get killed. Now, the investigation starts to focus on Dan. So, what did Dan say when he was interviewed at the crime scene?
When you have disagreements and possibly fight with Lisa, how would you describe those fights?
One-sided. She's normally the aggressor.
Have those fights ever become physical?
They have never became physical.
During Dan's interview with police, he tells several lies that are not congruent with the evidence. He denies that he's ever put his hands on Lisa. which now, with the secret tape from Lisa, we know is not true. It became clear to investigators that Dan could be, at the very least, covering up what happened.
When you look at Dan and potential motives, I think there's a lot of them there. You've got all of this tension, this estrangement, Dan's best friend being romantically involved with Lisa.
Lisa was talking about leaving. And so this pending separation and this threat of these children being removed, I think that created a pretty combustible situation.
So now we are considering Dan as being a primary suspect, but Dan lived in this residence. So DNA isn't going to help you. Hairs, fibers, fingerprints, none of that's going to help you in a case like this. This is a staged homicide case. And this scene was terribly staged. But when the detectives look back at the physical evidence, what do they see?
Lisa was a heavy person, and in order to put her in the position that she was in, it would take two people to be able to do it.
Now, we didn't believe it was just one person involved in this. So who would that somebody else be? They learn that Dan is a very socially inadequate individual. A lot of people would describe him as kind of this milquetoast guy who really didn't have a lot of say in what went on in his life. And then you've got his mother, who's very domineering, very controlling.
Everything seemed to revolve around his mom. He was susceptible to her and her alone.
Even though Dan was an adult, Carol would still pack his lunches for him for work.
She was still parenting him. In many respects, she dictated a lot of his decisions.
Carol was overly protective of her son. And, you know, Dan acquiesces to Carol all the time.
Carol had an ironclad control over her son. If she said something needed to be done, it was done. Because if it wasn't done, there was hell to pay. Whenever Carol spoke, Dan jumped, and he jumped immediately. Dan would do anything he could to make his mother happy, even at the cost of Lisa.
But did Dan hate his wife? Not as much as Carol hated his wife.
She made no bones about how she felt about Lisa, and she would tell anybody in no uncertain terms. She put her heart and soul into vilifying this poor girl. Carol's an evil woman.
Now that we understand the dynamics between mother and son, the investigation starts to focus on Dan and Carol. Detectives go back to the answering machine that Lisa and Dan had in their house and realize that is a critical piece of evidence.
Lisa, are you awake? Answer the phone. Your kids are up here.
That tape player was sent to the FBI laboratory for analysis.
What the detectives discovered is that after the time Lisa was murdered, Lisa's mom had made several phone calls because Lisa was supposed to be at her house and she never showed up. And yet when they looked at the answering machine, there were no messages from Lisa's mom.
And what the FBI uncovered was that Lisa's mother did call, but that message had been erased.
Lisa, wake up. Damn it.
So what does that suggest? It suggests manual manipulation of the tape by Carol. Carol's messages had recorded over it. After the very long investigation, Dan and Carol are both arrested. There were just so many things in this case that led police to believe this was a crime committed by mother and son. One in shooting, one creating the staged scene, moving together. And then we have manual manipulation of the tape at the scene, erasing Lisa's mother's message after Lisa had been murdered, and only having the messages from Carol.
A mother and son murder trial. That to me was very shocking, like a Hollywood movie. But we didn't have a murder weapon. There weren't any witnesses, and that's the whole job of a juror. You're gonna decide, could these two very ordinary people do this horrible, gruesome thing?
I remember being on the witness stand for 4 days, testifying for the prosecution. I told the court that Dan had been violent with Lisa, and Carol was controlling and manipulative.
The jury could see the big picture. This toxic mix between mother and son for what they saw as the greater good. And the greater good was, we have to get rid of Lisa. We can't let Lisa have the twins in this divorce. Dan is likely the shooter. Carol is the person who helped him. But that wasn't enough for Carol. She hated her so much, she concocted this whole scenario. She wanted her found like that.
My personal opinion is the staging was a last act of control. Carol was trying to impose the final word.
Both Carol and Dan are found guilty by the jury of murder, and both of them are sentenced to exceptionally long prison sentences.
They had no defense because it was a very poor job of staging. They didn't watch enough TV to be able to see how crimes are committed.
I recall seeing them in the courtroom. I never made eye contact with Carol. At that point, I was convinced she was subhuman. But he and I made eye contact a couple times. And I'm just like, why? Why? And all I ever got out of it was the barest of shrugs. After everything that had gone on, I had to get out of Washington State and make a new life. And that's the first time I'd felt any sort of real peace. But then the prosecuting attorney calls me to let me know that there was an appeal.
The two pleaded guilty to killing Carlson's wife in 1998 and then setting up the scene to make it look like a random rape and burglary.
I can't think of anything more repugnant than what you did with your son. And if it were within my power, and you get 200 years, and then some.
I don't feel justice was served, but I'm glad somebody else felt the outrage that we did.
The most tragic aspect is what happened to Lisa.
The kids never knew their mother. They have no memory of their mother.
what that's done to her children. And for what? For what?
These two twin boys, how do you square those relationships with those people in your life who committed the murder of your mother?
With the tragedy they all have had to endure, I hope they understand that their mother loved them beyond anything else.
You ever walk into a room and you could tell something just isn't right?
Who's the first person that you killed?
Sick, twisted people. They were more than mother and son.
There was rumors that they were in an incestuous relationship. Her having sex at her house, having sex in her van. There was sex parties. I have walked up on them, open mouth kissing. I was like, wow.
You've got a tragedy after tragedy. Something's not adding up.
She found her weakness, and then she played on his emotions.
Houses are nasty after somebody's died in it.
What the f? Conniving, vindictive, underhanded.
This is disgusting and twisted.
She's been murdered, and she's stuffed in a garbage can.
I don't even think the devil would be that evil. You go shoot him, and Mommy will be right here.
The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., cutting through the humid Florida night like a blade. The kind of ring that doesn't bring good news. The kind that makes a police dispatcher sit up straight even before the voice on the other end starts shaking. Because some sounds carry panic before words ever form. And this one did, breathless, fractured, saying there's something wrong, something isn't right, the door is open, the lights are on, and she never leaves the lights on when she goes out. In 1979, Florida was already learning how to live with fear, learning how quickly quiet neighborhoods could become headlines, how palm-lined streets could hide things that didn't belong under the sun, and on that night. In a small coastal town where people waved to their neighbors and locked their doors more out of habit than fear, a single unlocked house became a crime scene before dawn. By the time the first patrol car arrived, the air was thick with salt and heat, mosquitoes hovering in lazy circles, porch lights glowing like watchful eyes, and inside the house, time seemed to have stopped mid-motion. A purse sat on the kitchen counter, open, wallet untouched. Shoes rested by the door, neatly placed, as if their owner expected to return within minutes. A half-written grocery list lay on the table: milk, bread, eggs, one word trailing off as if interrupted. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture, just an absence so loud it felt like noise. She was 24 years old. Known. Recognizable. The kind of person whose name carried weight in a town this small. Not because she was famous, but because everyone knew her face. She worked at a local marina, laughed easily, helped her neighbors, had plans that stretched beyond the summer. That night, she vanished between one familiar moment and the next, swallowed by the dark without a witness willing to speak. Police called it a missing persons case at first. They always do. It's easier that way. Easier to believe someone chose to disappear than to accept the alternative creeping into the room with every unanswered question. Officers walked the neighborhood, knocked on doors, asked about strange cars, unfamiliar faces, raised voices slammed doors. People shook their heads. No, nothing. Just the usual night sounds. Crickets. Distant traffic. A television left on too loud. But missing didn't fit. Not here. Not her. By sunrise, the story had already begun to shift. Detectives returned to the house, this time slower, more deliberate, eyes scanning for what panic had missed the first time through. And then they saw it. A faint disturbance near the back door. Soil slightly displaced. A smudge on the frame where a hand might have steadied itself. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. But it was enough to turn a disappearance into something colder. The word cold case wouldn't be used for years. Back then, it was just an investigation running out of air. They found a single fingerprint on the inside of the doorframe, partial, oily, pressed at an odd angle. No match in local records. No name attached. It was photographed, dusted, lifted, logged, and sealed away in an evidence envelope marked with a date and a case number that would soon be buried under hundreds of others. In 1979, fingerprints were only as useful as the databases they lived in, and this one lived nowhere that mattered. The town watched closely at first. Volunteers searched marshland, ditches, abandoned lots. Boats moved slowly along the shoreline, eyes scanning the water for anything that didn't belong. Flyers went up on telephone poles, grocery store windows, gas station doors. Her face stared back from black and white paper, smiling, unaware of what she had already become. Days passed, then weeks. The media arrived, microphones pointed, cameras rolling, voices lowering into that familiar cadence reserved for tragedy. Mysterious disappearance. Young woman missing without a trace. Community in shock. The words stacked up like bricks, building a wall between hope and reality. Tips poured in at first, frantic and vague. A woman who looked like her seen at a bus station. A scream heard late at night. A car parked where it didn't belong. Each lead unraveled under scrutiny, leaving behind only more silence. Detectives began tracing her last known movements. She'd left work on time. Talked briefly with a coworker. Bought a soda at a corner store, confirmed by a receipt that felt heavier than it should have. She drove home, parked in her usual spot. And then, somewhere between the driver's seat and the kitchen counter, the timeline shattered. Suspects emerged the way they always do. A former boyfriend with a temper. A coworker who lingered too long in conversation. A drifter seen near the marina days earlier. Each was questioned. Each denied involvement. Alibis were thin but unbreakable enough to withstand the tools of the time. No DNA. No cameras. No digital trail. Just memories, impressions, and the dangerous flexibility of human recollection. Behind closed doors, detectives argued. Some believed she knew her abductor. The lack of forced entry suggested familiarity, trust, or deception practiced enough to look like trust. Others believed it was a crime of opportunity, a wrong place, wrong time collision with someone who had done this before, someone careful, someone who left almost nothing behind. Almost nothing. The fingerprint resurfaced again and again in meetings, passed around like a ghost everyone could see, but no one could name. It became a symbol of frustration, a physical reminder that someone had been there, had touched the threshold between safety and whatever waited beyond it, and walked away unrecognized. As months turned into years, attention drifted. New crimes took priority. New victims demanded headlines. The town learned to live around the absence, the way people learned to live around a scar. Her house was sold. Her belongings boxed up. Her name spoken less often, then mostly in past tense. The case file thickened with paperwork, but thinned of momentum. Detectives retired. Evidence was moved, reorganized, mislabeled, nearly lost during a departmental relocation that no one remembered clearly afterward. The fingerprint remained, still sealed, still unidentified, quietly aging in a metal cabinet that hummed under fluorescent lights. By the mid-1980s, the case was officially inactive. Not closed, just sleeping. People still whispered about it, though. About the night she vanished. About how safe the town had felt before, and how something invisible had shifted afterward. Parents walked their children home instead of watching from the porch. Doors locked earlier. Trust grew conditional. The story became a warning passed down, reshaped with each telling. Less about her and more about what could happen when you least expect it. And somewhere, out there beyond the reach of aging file cabinets and fading memories, someone knew exactly what had happened inside that quiet house in 1979. Someone who had left behind a single ridge of skin, pressed in haste or confidence, never imagining it would outlive the fear of that night. The case didn't end. It just went quiet. And quiet, in cases like this, is never the same as gone. Years slid by without ceremony, the way they always do when a case stops making noise, when a file becomes weight instead of urgency, and the Florida sun kept rising over the same streets that had once been sealed with yellow tape, bleaching the memory of that night until it felt almost imagined. Almost unreal, except for the people who still woke up thinking about it, the ones who measured time as before and after she disappeared. Inside the police department, the case lived on as a folder with softened edges, pages yellowing, ink fading, a name typed at the top that younger officers recognized only vaguely, if at all. New recruits heard it mentioned sometimes, usually late at night, usually by veterans who spoke quietly, the way people do when talking about something that still feels unfinished. They called it unlucky. They called it clean. Too clean. The fingerprint remained the most stubborn artifact of the investigation. A partial ridge pattern, smudged just enough to resist certainty, preserved carefully but misunderstood completely. Back then, Fingerprint comparison was a manual ritual, human eyes tracing loops and whorls under magnifying glass, flipping through index cards stored in drawers that stretched on like library stacks. If the print wasn't already in the system, it might as well have belonged to a ghost. And for years, that's exactly what it felt like. A ghost hand on a doorframe. The detectives who had worked the case aged alongside it. One retired early, worn down by too many unsolved questions. Another transferred to a different county, carrying the frustration with him like luggage he never unpacked. When they spoke about the disappearance, their voices hardened, not with anger, but with something heavier. Regret. The kind that lingers because you don't know what else you could have done differently, only that the ending never came. In the town itself, life adjusted. New families moved in, unaware of the story behind certain glances, certain pauses in conversation. The marina hired new staff. The grocery store remodeled. The house where she vanished changed owners twice, then 3 times, each renovation sanding away traces of the past. Still, some neighbors refused to walk past it at night. They crossed the street instead, without quite knowing why. Every few years, a tip would surface, usually sparked by a documentary, a newspaper anniversary piece, a rumor drifting in from somewhere else. A man arrested in another state. A body found that didn't match anyone on record. Detectives reopened the file just enough to confirm what they already suspected. No connection. No closure. The fingerprint was checked again, always with the same result. No match. By the early 1990s, technology began to whisper promises it couldn't yet keep. Computerized databases expanded. Fingerprint records migrated from paper to pixels. The old evidence was boxed up again, relabeled, shipped to storage, including that envelope, still intact, still waiting. It was during one of these transitions that the case almost disappeared for good. A clerical error, minor, forgettable, the kind that happens when departments move buildings and people rush to meet deadlines. The box containing her file was misfiled under an outdated case number. For nearly 3 years, no one could say exactly where it was. No one noticed. When it resurfaced, pulled from storage during an unrelated audit, it was treated like a curiosity, a relic from another era of policing, a reminder of how far investigative tools had come. One officer flipped through the pages, pausing at the familiar black and white photograph clipped to the front, the smile frozen, eternally unaware. He shook his head and slid the folder back into the box. Still unsolved. Still silent. Outside the department, the world changed faster. DNA entered the conversation. Cold cases found new life in labs and headlines. Stories once thought buried began resurfacing with shocking conclusions. Arrests made decades after crimes committed. Confessions extracted from men who thought time had erased their guilt. The phrase cold case solved started appearing more often, sending ripples of hope through communities that had waited far too long. But this case stayed frozen. No biological evidence to test. No weapon to re-examine. No body to speak for the missing. Just that fingerprint. And fingerprints, despite their promise, require something to collide with. They need a match. A name. A reason to look again. That reason came quietly, almost accidentally, in the late 2000s when a statewide initiative began digitizing old evidence logs, not to solve cases but to clean house, to modernize records before another generation retired and took its institutional memory with it. Technicians moved methodically through storage rooms, scanning, cataloging, uploading. It was routine work. Boring work. The kind no one associates with breakthroughs. Until one technician paused. The envelope was unremarkable. Standard issue. Yellowed. But inside, the lifted fingerprint was still crisp enough to read, preserved better than many from that era. The technician flagged it for digitization, more out of protocol than curiosity, and fed it into the system, converting physical ridges into data points, unaware of what had just been nudged awake. The system searched. At first, nothing happened. The progress bar crept forward, slow, deliberate. Then it stalled. An alert flashed, not confirmation, not rejection, but something in between. Possible correlation. Low confidence. The technician frowned, ran it again. Same result. In another time, another place, that would have been the end of it. But by then, databases had grown. Not just local. Not just state. They talked to each other now, shared histories, accumulated decades of fingerprints collected for reasons both small and severe. Traffic stops. Military service. Minor arrests. Lives documented in ink without anyone realizing how permanent that documentation would become. The technician escalated the result. A supervisor took a look. Then another. The name attached to the potential match didn't mean anything to them at first. Middle-aged. Florida resident. No violent felony record. Nothing that screamed suspect. But the timestamp did. The print in the system had been entered years after 1979, following a routine arrest for an unrelated offense, something forgettable, something that never made the news. The kind of arrest a person shrugs off, confident it won't follow them forever. Except it had. The supervisor notified a detective assigned to cold case reviews, a position that existed largely because of stories like this, because departments had learned that sometimes answers don't come from new questions, but from old evidence finally finding its voice. The detective pulled the file, read it slowly, carefully, absorbing the weight of what might be unfolding. He didn't celebrate. Not yet. Possible matches were dangerous. They raised hopes they couldn't always keep. He requested a full comparison, higher resolution, more scrutiny. Analysts worked the ridges, aligning points, counting characteristics, cross-referencing angles, and pressure distortions. The result came back late in the afternoon. This time, the language was different. High confidence. The fingerprint on the doorframe and the fingerprint in the database belonged to the same person. For the first time in decades, the case exhaled. The detective leaned back in his chair, staring at the name on the screen, letting it settle. The man had lived quietly, worked steady jobs, paid taxes, raised a family. He had been in Florida in 1979. He had lived less than 30 miles from the marina. There was no obvious connection on paper, no prior suspicion, no reason his name would have ever surfaced during the original investigation. And that, more than anything, was what made the room feel suddenly smaller. Someone had walked free for nearly 30 years, not because he was invisible, but because the system hadn't been ready to see him yet. The detective closed the file and stood up, already knowing that the quiet this case had lived in for so long was about to end, that somewhere out there, a man who thought the past was sealed had no idea a forgotten fingerprint had just found him. The name sat on the page longer than it should have, heavy in a way names usually aren't, because once you give a mystery a name, it stops being theoretical, it stops being an absence, and starts becoming a person who breathes, who wakes up in the morning believing his life is settled, unaware that a door he touched decades ago has just been reopened. The detective didn't move fast. Not yet. Cold cases punish impatience. They reward restraint. Before a single knock on a door, every assumption had to be dismantled, every detail re-examined under the light of what was now possible. A fingerprint match was powerful, but it wasn't a confession, and history was full of cases that collapsed because investigators rushed the moment that felt like victory. He went back to the beginning. The night, the house, the lack of forced entry, the quiet vanishing, and now, layered over it all, a man who had been close enough to touch the frame of her back door, close enough to leave proof. Records were pulled. Old addresses, employment histories, traffic citations, anything that could map his movements in the late 1970s. It wasn't easy. Data from that era was fragmented, analog, prone to gaps that no technology could fully erase. But patterns emerged. He had worked construction jobs up and down the coast. Short-term contracts. No fixed schedule. He had reason to be in that town. He had reason to know the area. The detective compared timelines. On the week she disappeared, the man had been between jobs. No pay stubs. No clock-ins. Just a vague note in an old personnel file indicating temporary layoff. It wasn't proof. But it was space. Space where anything could have happened. Next came the harder part. Reopening old wounds. The detective contacted people who hadn't spoken to law enforcement in decades. Former neighbors, co-workers, friends who had moved on but never quite let go. He introduced himself gently, explained why he was calling, and listened to the silence on the other end of the line stretch uncomfortably before questions arrived. Some didn't want to talk. Some had built lives that didn't include that chapter anymore. Others spoke with surprising clarity, as if the memories had been waiting for permission to resurface. They remembered the fear, the shock, the way the town felt smaller afterward. They remembered how careful everyone became. But when asked about the name, the reaction was always the same. Confusion. Blank stares through the phone. No one recalled him. No rumors. No whispers. He hadn't stood out then, and he didn't stand out now. That too fit. The detective requested surveillance, not the obvious kind. No squad cars parked outside. No visible pressure. Just observation. Where he went. Who he spoke to. What his routines looked like. The man lived quietly, predictably. Same coffee shop in the morning. Same route to work. Same house he'd lived in for over 15 years. Neighbors described him as polite. Helpful. Boring. There were no signs of panic. No sudden changes in behavior. If the past weighed on him, it didn't show. Which raised another possibility. What if he didn't know the fingerprint had been left behind? What if, in his mind, that night had been clean, controlled, erased as thoroughly as he believed the years had erased it from everyone else? The detective ordered a full background check. Not just criminal history, but civil records, restraining orders, complaints that never made it past a front desk. The list was thin. A bar fight in the early 1980s. A domestic disturbance call that resulted in no charges. A pattern of moving jobs rather than losing them. Enough to suggest volatility without confirming it. Enough to suggest someone who learned how to stay just inside the lines. Still, none of it tied him directly to her. The fingerprint was the anchor. Everything else had to orbit around it. Forensic analysts were asked to revisit the print again, independently, to ensure the match could withstand a courtroom, withstand scrutiny from defense experts whose job would be to tear it apart. Each analyst came back with the same conclusion. The ridge patterns aligned. The pressure points matched. The angle was consistent with someone entering or exiting quickly, one hand bracing against the frame. It wasn't a casual touch. The detective returned to the house, now occupied by people who knew nothing of its history. He stood near the back door, imagining the movement, the sequence of events compressed into a few seconds that had changed everything. The door opening inward. A step forward. A hand pressing against the wood. The moment where choice became action. And then nothing. No blood. No signs of struggle. No screams reported. Whatever happened next had happened somewhere else, or had happened in a way that left no visible trace behind. The absence gnawed at him. Cold cases often come with too much evidence, tangled and contradictory. This one had too little. And now, suddenly, one piece threatened to outweigh all the others. Before moving forward, the detective sought approval from the state attorney's office. They reviewed the file with cautious interest. A fingerprint after nearly 30 years was compelling, but not conclusive. They would need corroboration. Something more than a ridge pattern on a doorframe. Something that placed the man in the story, not just at the threshold. The detective understood. He needed leverage. He ordered a discreet interview. Not an arrest. Not an accusation. Just a conversation. The kind designed to observe reactions, to let silence do the work. The request was framed carefully. A routine follow-up regarding an old investigation. Nothing to alarm. When officers knocked on the man's door, he answered calmly. Middle-aged now. Graying. A face shaped by years of ordinary routines. He listened, nodded, agreed to come down to the station voluntarily. He drove himself. Parked. Walked in without hesitation. Inside the interview room, the air felt familiar to him, though he had no reason to think so. He sat comfortably. Asked if this would take long. Mentioned he had dinner plans. The detective started broad. Questions about his work history. His time in Florida in the late 70s. Places he'd lived. People he'd known. The man answered easily, confidently, his timeline smooth, rehearsed not by planning, but by repetition over years of telling the same harmless stories. Then the detective narrowed the frame. The marina. The neighborhood. The house. The man paused. Just for a moment. Barely noticeable. But it was there. A fraction of a second where his eyes shifted, where the rhythm of his breathing changed. He said he didn't remember the house. Said he passed through lots of towns back then. Construction work blurred everything together. The detective let the silence stretch. Finally, he slid a photograph across the table. Not the fingerprint. Not yet. A photograph of the house as it looked in 1979. The man studied it carefully, too carefully, as if trying to locate something specific in the image. I don't recall this place, he said again. The detective nodded, collected the photo, and thanked him for his time. No confrontation. No accusation. The man left looking mildly irritated, not frightened. If he was hiding something, he was hiding it well. But as the door closed behind him, the detective knew something had shifted. The case was no longer dormant. It was awake, stretching, testing the weight of its own history. And somewhere between that forgotten fingerprint and a man who insisted on his own normalcy, the truth was pressing forward, not loudly, not yet, but with the slow, unstoppable pressure of time finally running out. After the interview, the air inside the unit felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening now, as if the case had crossed some invisible line between theory and confrontation. And once that line is crossed, there is no way to pretend the past is content to stay buried. The detective replayed the footage again and again, watching the man's face for what language couldn't hide, studying the pauses, the swallowed breaths, the micro-adjustments people make when they feel a memory brush too close to the surface. Nothing exploded. No confession cracked open the room. But there was a disturbance, subtle and unmistakable, like a ripple across water that had been still for decades. The state attorney wanted more. They always do. Fingerprints tell you who touched a place, not why, and certainly not what happened after. Without a body, without physical proof of violence, the narrative remained fragile. The case needed weight. It needed gravity strong enough to pull a jury into a moment they could never witness. So the detective widened the lens. He revisited every statement from 1979, this time reading them through the filter of a known name. Patterns that once felt meaningless began to rearrange themselves. A neighbor had reported a vehicle idling near the marina late that evening. A co-worker remembered her mentioning a man who asked too many questions about her schedule. At the time, those details had been filed away as noise. Now they demanded attention. The vehicle description was vague. Dark-colored. Older model. Common enough to belong to half the county. But records showed the man owned a similar car during that period, sold years later, scrapped, erased like so many physical traces of the past. The detective tracked down the co-worker, now retired, living 2 counties away. She hesitated at first, clearly uncomfortable reopening a memory she had learned to seal. But when she spoke, her voice tightened. She remembered the man more clearly now. Not his face, but his presence. The way he lingered. The way he watched instead of listened. She remembered warning her friend to be careful. It felt small at the time. It felt stupid. It didn't feel stupid anymore. Another witness came forward after a quiet call for information was circulated among law enforcement circles. A former bartender from a place the man used to frequent remembered a heated conversation between him and a young woman matching her description. He dismissed it as a lover's spat. Florida was full of those. But now, with decades between then and now, the memory had sharpened. The woman had looked frightened. Not angry. Still, memories decay. Defense attorneys thrive on that decay. The detective knew every recollection would be questioned, every gap exploited. He needed something harder. Something that didn't rely on emotion or interpretation. He ordered a renewed search of all physical evidence, however limited. The fingerprint envelope was reopened under controlled conditions. The doorframe itself was long gone, remodeled, repainted, its past sealed beneath layers of renovation. But other items from the house had been preserved. Clothing, the purse, the shoes, objects that once belonged to a life interrupted. Forensic science had evolved beyond what the original investigators could have imagined. Touch DNA, trace fibers, microscopic transfers that once slipped through unnoticed. Analysts worked carefully, methodically, understanding the pressure of time, the significance of what they might find. Days turned into weeks. The waiting was unbearable in its own quiet way. Every phone call made the detective straighten. Every email notification felt heavier than it should. Then the call came. A trace profile had been recovered from the interior of the purse. Partial, degraded, not enough to stand alone, but enough to compare. The lab ran it against state and federal databases, aware of the risks, aware of the expectations. The result wasn't definitive, but it was consistent. Consistent with the man whose fingerprint had touched the doorframe. The state attorney exhaled slowly when the report hit the desk. This changed things. Not enough to guarantee a conviction, but enough to justify a move that would send shockwaves through a life carefully built on the assumption that the past was inert. A search warrant was approved. The detective didn't lead the team himself. He watched from the periphery as officers approached the house, the man's house, early in the morning, the same hour when decades earlier, a phone had rung with news no one wanted to hear. The symmetry wasn't lost on him. Inside, the search was meticulous. Every box, every drawer, every crawl space. They weren't looking for the impossible. No one expected to find a body or a weapon. They were looking for confirmation, for relics, for anything that suggested memory hadn't been completely erased. In a box in the garage, beneath old tax returns and instruction manuals, they found photographs. Not of her, not directly, but of places. The marina, the street where she lived. Angles that suggested observation rather than coincidence. The dates on the backs were faded, but legible enough to place them around the same time she disappeared. In a bedroom drawer, wrapped carefully in a cloth, they found a watch. A woman's watch. Style consistent with the late 1970s. The man claimed he'd bought it at a flea market years later. There was no receipt. No memory of where. The watch had been listed among her missing belongings. When confronted, the man didn't panic. He grew rigid. His answers became clipped, defensive. He repeated that he didn't know her, that he'd never been in her house, that the items were coincidences. Bad luck. The detective watched closely. Bad luck doesn't leave fingerprints. The arrest came quietly. No sirens. No spectacle. Just the sound of handcuffs closing around wrists that had been free for nearly 3 decades. The charge wasn't murder. Not yet. It was kidnapping. Unlawful confinement. Enough to bring him into custody while the rest of the case solidified. News broke within hours. Headlines spread fast, almost breathless. Florida 1979 cold case solved. Forgotten fingerprint leads to sudden arrest. The town that had learned to live with the absence felt the ground shift beneath it. People who hadn't spoken her name in years suddenly remembered it clearly. Families gathered around televisions. Old neighbors called each other, voices trembling. But inside the detective's office, celebration was restrained. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because now, the man knew the past was no longer quiet. And men who have lived that long believing they got away with something don't always respond to being awakened in the same way. Some talk, some fight, and some, when cornered by time itself, decide they have nothing left to lose. Custody changes people, even the ones who swear they have nothing to hide, and the moment the door closed behind him, the moment freedom became conditional, the calm he had worn for years began to crack in places he couldn't fully control. Jail has a way of stripping away routine, of forcing the past to speak when there's nothing left to distract from it, and for the first time since 1979, he had nothing but time and the sound of his own breathing to keep him company. Interviews resumed under a different light. No longer casual. No longer framed as assistants. Now the questions carried weight, sharpened by evidence, by photographs laid out like silent witnesses, by a watch resting in an evidence bag that refused to explain itself away. He denied everything. Again, he said the fingerprint meant nothing. Said he'd done construction work in dozens of houses, that door frames were door frames, that memories blurred when you worked with your hands. He said the purse DNA was contamination. He said the photos were artistic, that he liked documenting places he'd worked near, that there was no meaning behind them. His voice stayed steady, but his body betrayed him. Shoulders tight, jaw locked, hands clenched when the detective mentioned her name, as if the sound itself triggered something old and unwelcome. The detective let him talk. Let him build his version of events brick by brick, knowing that lies, unlike truth, require maintenance. They sag under their own weight if you give them enough room. Outside the interview room, prosecutors worked through the night. They reconstructed timelines with surgical precision, mapping his movements against hers, overlaying witness statements, employment gaps, phone records where available. They looked for moments where coincidence strained credibility, where the explanation required too much luck to survive scrutiny. One moment stood out. On the night she disappeared, a gas station receipt placed him less than 10 minutes from her house, purchased within the window when she would have been arriving home. The station attendant from that shift was long gone, the security footage erased decades earlier, but the timestamp on the receipt remained stubbornly exact. He claimed he was just passing through, just stopping for fuel. But passing through doesn't explain why his fingerprint ended up inside her doorframe. The pressure mounted quietly. Bail was denied. The charges expanded. Media interest intensified. Reporters dug into his past, speaking to ex-partners, former co-workers, anyone willing to share a memory that suddenly felt relevant. Some described him as intense. Others said controlling. One former girlfriend recalled how he hated being ignored, how rejection made his temper surface in ways that felt disproportionate, unsettling. These weren't crimes, but they were context. Inside the jail, the man began to feel the walls closing in. Fellow inmates recognized his face from the news. Cold cases carry a particular stigma. They suggest patience, planning. Guilt aged like wine instead of fading. He kept to himself, stopped eating regularly, lost weight. Guards noticed him pacing at night, muttering, replaying arguments with no one in the room. Then he asked to speak to the detective. It wasn't a confession. Not yet. It was framed as frustration, a desire to set the record straight. He complained about being misunderstood, about the media painting him as a monster. He insisted he deserved a chance to explain. The detective agreed, knowing exactly what this was. A crack in the wall. This time, the room felt different. The man's voice wavered when he spoke about the watch. He admitted he'd recognized it when investigators showed him the missing items list. Admitted he might have picked it up years earlier, might have forgotten where it came from. Memory is funny like that, he said. Especially when you're young. The detective didn't interrupt. He pressed gently, asked how a man forgets acquiring an object linked to a woman who vanished the same year. Asked how coincidence kept finding him. The man's answers grew tangled. He contradicted himself, corrected himself, retreated behind silence when words failed him. Then he said it, almost casually. He said he remembered her. Not by name, but by place. The marina. The way she'd laughed when he tried to impress her. The way she'd brushed him off. The way she'd said no. The room went still. He backtracked immediately, said he meant he remembered seeing her around town, that everyone did. But the damage was done. He had placed himself in her orbit. He had admitted familiarity that no evidence had yet forced from him. The detective leaned forward, voice low, controlled. Asked him to keep talking. Asked him to explain why that night mattered enough to remember decades later. The man stared at the table. His breathing quickened. Sweat gathered at his temples. For a moment, it looked like the truth might surface, raw and uncontrollable. But fear won. He shut down. Requested a lawyer. The interview ended. Still, something irreversible had happened. His story now had seams. Weak points. Admissions he couldn't pull back into himself no matter how hard he tried. Prosecutors seized on it. They prepared to upgrade the charges, to argue that what began as kidnapping had ended in homicide, even without a body, even without a known location. Florida law allowed it, under the right circumstances, when evidence pointed to a disappearance so complete it could only end one way. The town watched closely. Vigils appeared where none had stood in years. Flowers lined the edge of the marina. People spoke her name aloud again, not as a warning this time, but as a demand. And in a cell that smelled of disinfectant and old metal, the man lay awake at night, staring at a ceiling he couldn't touch, realizing too late that the fingerprint he never thought about had waited longer than he ever could, patient and silent, until the moment it decided to speak. The announcement came without ceremony, folded into a routine press briefing, but the words landed like a shockwave all the same. Prosecutors were seeking an indictment for murder. No remains. No final scene. Just a constellation of evidence that, taken together, told a story too coherent to ignore. For the first time since 1979, the state was willing to say out loud what everyone had feared in silence. She was not coming home. The community reacted in fragments. Some felt relief, believing the acknowledgement itself was a form of justice. Others recoiled, unsettled by the idea that certainty could exist without proof you could point to, touch, bury. The absence of a body had always been a psychological shield, a thin one, but a shield nonetheless. Now it was gone. Inside the courthouse, the case transformed from investigation to battle. Defense attorneys moved quickly, filing motions designed to fracture the narrative before it ever reached a jury. They attacked the fingerprint first, calling it outdated, degraded, vulnerable to misinterpretation. They argued that standards from 1979 couldn't be retrofitted to modern certainty, that the chain of custody had stretched too long, too thin. The state countered with expert testimony. Analysts explained ridge detail, explained why partial prints, when preserved correctly, can be just as individual as full ones. They spoke calmly, methodically, the language of science steady against the noise of doubt. Next came the DNA. The defense dismissed it as inconclusive, secondary, circumstantial. The prosecution agreed, almost eagerly. It wasn't the foundation, they said. It was confirmation. One voice in a chorus that had been singing the same tune for decades. Then came the witnesses. The co-worker. the bartender. Each took the stand with visible reluctance, aware that memory is a fragile thing to offer under oath. They spoke of impressions, of feelings that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt heavy. Defense attorneys pressed them hard, pointing out inconsistencies, the unreliability of recollections stretched across decades. The witnesses held their ground, not because they were certain of every detail, but because they were certain of how they had felt. The gas station receipt was introduced next. A thin piece of paper, enlarged and projected, its timestamp unambiguous. The defense argued coincidence. Florida was full of gas stations, full of cars, full of people passing through. The prosecution asked a simple question in response. How many of those people left a fingerprint inside the victim's home that same night? The courtroom went quiet. Then the photographs. The images of the marina. The street. Angles that suggested waiting rather than wandering. The defense tried to recast them as innocent documentation, artistic curiosity. But art has intention, and the jury could feel it. Finally, the watch. The object that refused to behave like a coincidence. An expert testified that the model and serial range matched those sold locally during the years before she vanished. The defense argued flea markets. The prosecution asked why an innocent purchase had been wrapped carefully and hidden away. Throughout it all, the man sat motionless, eyes fixed forward, jaw set so tight it seemed carved from stone. He did not testify. He did not look back at the gallery. Whatever version of the past lived inside him, he kept it sealed. Outside the courtroom, the media kept count. Days, motions, arguments. The phrase cold case solved echoed across headlines again and again, sometimes triumphant, sometimes cautious, always charged. For her family, there was no triumph, just endurance. They sat together, hands clasped, listening to strangers dissect a life they remembered as warm and ordinary. Then came the moment everyone had been circling. The judge ruled the evidence sufficient to proceed. The indictment stood. The trial would move forward. It wasn't a verdict, but it was validation, an acknowledgement that what happened in 1979 mattered enough to confront now, no matter how late the hour, no matter how incomplete the picture still felt. As the courtroom emptied, the detective lingered, watching the man being led away. For a brief second, their eyes met. There was no anger there, no defiance, just something tired, something like resignation. The detective wondered if that was what justice looked like after all these years. Not closure, not peace, just the slow, unavoidable narrowing of the world until there is nowhere left for the past to hide. And yet, even as the case marched forward, one question continued to hang in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Where was she? Without that answer, the story remained incomplete, a melody missing its final note. And in the silence between court dates and headlines, investigators returned to the one place they hadn't searched in decades, the spaces between memory and geography, hoping that time, having finally broken its silence once, might be willing to do so again. The question refused to fade. It followed investigators out of the courtroom, into their cars, into the quiet moments when the machinery of justice slowed and the human weight of it all rushed back in. A conviction without a body was possible, but a body meant truth made tangible, meant an ending the living could point to and say, this is where she rests, this is where the waiting stops. So the search began again, not with hope, but with precision. They returned to maps drawn decades earlier, spreading them across tables now illuminated by modern screens, overlaying old hand-drawn notes with satellite imagery that revealed what the land had become since 1979. Marshes drained, roads expanded, construction swallowed empty fields. Florida's landscape had shifted, but water remembered. Soil remembered. The man's past movements were plotted in painstaking detail. Job sites, temporary housing, bars he frequented, routes between them. Investigators focused on places that fit a specific kind of geography, areas close enough to reach quickly, remote enough to feel safe, places a man in a hurry would choose without thinking too hard. One location surfaced again and again. A stretch of wetlands several miles inland, accessible by a narrow service road that existed in 1979 but no longer appeared on most modern maps. At the time, it bordered a construction site where the man had briefly worked. Heavy machinery had come and gone. Earth had been turned, packed, reshaped. It was the kind of place where something could disappear without ceremony. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Handlers watched closely as they worked the area, noses low, bodies tense. Dogs don't understand time the way people do. They don't know decades from days. They only know scent. One dog alerted near a cluster of cypress trees. Another showed interest nearby, circling, pulling slightly at the leash. The reactions weren't definitive. They never are. But they were enough to stop conversation cold. The ground was tested. Soil samples taken. Core drills pressed down through layers of history. Nothing conclusive surfaced at first. No remains. No clothing. Just earth that had been disturbed long ago and then left to settle back into itself. Still, investigators stayed. They expanded the search radius. They dug where logic suggested and where intuition whispered. Days passed under relentless sun. Sweat soaked through uniforms. The media hovered at the edges, waiting for a breakthrough they could frame in bold type. Nothing came. Frustration set in, sharp and familiar. It felt too much like 1979. Too much like standing at the edge of something and realizing the truth might be just out of reach again. Some investigators argued to pull resources, to focus on the trial instead. Others pushed back, insisting that persistence itself was a form of respect. Then a former co-worker of the man reached out, prompted by the renewed attention. He was older now, voice gravelly, memory uneven, but he remembered something he hadn't thought about in years. A late-night job. A rush. The man had asked to borrow a truck, said he needed to move equipment before morning. It had seemed odd at the time. Construction work usually waited for daylight. The date mattered. It matched the week she vanished. The location mattered more. The equipment had been stored near the wetlands. The same wetlands investigators were standing in now. Search efforts intensified. This time, they brought in ground-penetrating radar. The technology traced invisible lines beneath the surface, looking for disturbances that didn't belong. Patterns emerged. Subtle, ambiguous, but suggestive. Excavation began carefully, deliberately. Every inch documented. Every find catalogued. Hours turned into days. The world narrowed to soil and possibility. Then, at a depth inconsistent with natural layering, a fragment surfaced. Not bone. Fabric. Faded. Worn thin by time and moisture. Analysts paused. The pattern was floral. The color washed out but familiar. It matched a blouse she had been wearing the day she disappeared. The site went silent. More fragments followed. Buttons. A zipper pull. Items degraded but unmistakable in context. Still no remains. Still no finality. But this was no coincidence. This was not random debris. The discovery shifted everything. Prosecutors amended their strategy. The defense scrambled, filing motions, arguing contamination, arguing assumption. But the narrative had gained a physical anchor. The story now had a place. The man was informed. He listened without expression, eyes fixed on the table, face unreadable. When asked if he wanted to say anything, he shook his head. Whatever truth he carried, he kept it locked away, perhaps believing silence was still safer than speech. The trial date approached. Jury selection began. Potential jurors were asked if they could weigh evidence without seeing a body, without hearing a confession. Some said no. They were dismissed. Others said yes, their voices steady but eyes uncertain. Outside, the town held its breath again. The wetlands became a symbol, a quiet expanse now burdened with meaning. People drove past slowly, imagining what had been hidden beneath the surface for so long, imagining how close they had come without ever knowing it. And beneath the courtroom arguments and legal maneuvers, beneath the science and testimony, one truth settled heavily into the collective consciousness. She hadn't vanished into nothing. She had been taken somewhere, left somewhere, and the land, patient and indifferent, had guarded that secret for decades, until human persistence finally pressed hard enough to make it answer back. The fragments changed the temperature of the room in ways no argument ever could. Evidence with weight, with texture, with the unmistakable cruelty of time etched into every fiber. The prosecution didn't rush to display it. They understood restraint. They understood that when you show a jury something that has waited decades to be seen, you don't shout. You let silence do the work. Court resumed under a different gravity. The defense adjusted its posture, no longer dismissive, now surgical, choosing its battles carefully, conceding small points to protect larger ones. They argued the wetlands were a dump site, not a crime scene. They argued the items could have been planted. They argued uncertainty, because uncertainty was all they had left. The prosecution countered with chronology. They walked the jury through the timeline step by step, hour by hour, not as speculation but as accumulation. The receipt, the fingerprint, the photographs, the watch, the fragments. Each piece alone might wobble. Together, they formed something rigid, something difficult to bend without breaking. Expert witnesses returned to the stand. Soil analysts explained stratification, how layers settle over time, how disturbances leave signatures that persist even after decades of rain and growth. The fabric hadn't migrated there. It had been placed, buried, forgotten. The defense cross-examined aggressively, suggesting contamination, poor documentation, bias driven by publicity. The experts didn't flinch. They spoke in probabilities and processes, not absolutes, knowing credibility lived there. Then the prosecution did something unexpected. They played a portion of the man's own interview. Just a few minutes. His voice, calm at first, then strained, then the slip. The admission he tried to erase. I remember her. The courtroom leaned in. Jurors watched his face on the screen, the way his posture changed, the way his words stumbled when memory pushed back. No accusation carried more weight than a man placing himself where he had sworn he'd never been. The defense objected. The judge overruled. Family members in the gallery closed their eyes. Some couldn't watch. Others watched everything, determined not to look away again. Closing arguments came with a tension that felt almost physical. The prosecution spoke about time, about how it doesn't erase truth, only hides it, about how patience, not luck, had finally brought this case back into the light. They didn't ask the jury to imagine violence. They asked them to imagine absence, to imagine the space she left behind, the ordinary life interrupted without explanation. The defense urged caution. They warned against emotion. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof hadn't changed just because the story was old. They argued that the state was asking them to connect dots that might never have belonged together. Deliberation took longer than anyone expected. Hours stretched into days. The jury requested transcripts, asked to see the fingerprint analysis again, asked to hear the interview clip one more time. Each request felt like a heartbeat echoing through the courthouse. Outside, reporters speculated. Inside, no one spoke. When the verdict finally came, the room filled quickly, everyone drawn by the gravity of the moment. The man stood as the foreperson read the decision, voice steady, words deliberate. Guilty. Not on every count, but on the ones that mattered most. Kidnapping. Murder. There was no outburst. No collapse. Just a collective release of breath that felt like it had been held for nearly 30 years. Some cried quietly. Others stared straight ahead, absorbing what justice looked like when it arrived late but undeniable. The man showed little reaction. He blinked once, swallowed, sat down. Sentencing followed weeks later. The judge spoke of the cruelty of silence, of the harm done not only in the act itself, but in the decades that followed, in the unanswered questions inflicted on a family and a community. A lengthy sentence was imposed. Not symbolic, substantial. A life measured not in years, but in the absence of freedom. And still, even after the gavel fell, something remained unresolved. The fragments from the wetlands were not enough. They told part of the story, but not the ending. The place where she had been left was not the place where she had been found. The earth had offered clues, not a conclusion. As the man was led away for the final time, the detective watched, thinking about the question that no verdict could fully answer. Why now? Why had a fingerprint waited decades to speak, and why had it chosen this moment? The answer was uncomfortable in its simplicity. Because truth doesn't rush. It accumulates. It waits for the world to catch up. And as the courthouse emptied, as the town began to recalibrate around a word it hadn't used in decades, one thought lingered like an echo that refused to fade. Solved does not mean finished. Solved did not mean healed. The word landed cleanly in headlines, sharp and satisfying, but inside the community it behaved differently, stirring sediment that had settled for decades, pulling memories back to the surface that people had learned to live beneath. Justice had arrived, but it brought questions with it, and questions don't disappear just because a verdict is read aloud. In the weeks after sentencing, the town changed its posture. Conversations grew quieter, more deliberate. People revisited old assumptions, old nights, old choices. Some wondered how close they'd been without knowing it. Some wondered what they might have missed. The marina held a small memorial, unannounced, informal, flowers tied to railings where she used to work, the water moving past as it always had, indifferent and eternal. The detective returned to the wetlands alone. No search teams. No media. Just him and the place that had finally spoken after so long. He walked the perimeter slowly, listening to the insects, the wind through the trees, the soundscape unchanged since 1979. This wasn't where the story had ended, but it was where the silence had cracked. He thought about the man now behind bars, about the decades he'd lived freely, about the ordinary life that had grown around an act of extraordinary violence. Evil, the detective realized, rarely announces itself. It blends in. It ages. It shops for groceries and pays utility bills. It waits. Requests began arriving from other departments. Other cold cases. Other forgotten prints. The fingerprint that solved this case had become proof of concept, a reminder that evidence doesn't expire, only patience does. Analysts re-examined archives with renewed urgency. What else was waiting? What other ghosts were sealed in envelopes no one had opened in years? The family spoke publicly for the first time in decades. Not with anger. With exhaustion. They thanked investigators. They thanked the jury. They spoke her name carefully, deliberately, as if each syllable carried weight. They didn't claim closure. They said something quieter instead. They said they could finally breathe. Behind the scenes, appeals began, as they always do. Defense attorneys filed motions questioning evidence, procedure, fairness. The system responded methodically, unmoved by emotion, grinding forward as it was designed to. The verdict held. The sentence stood. Still, one thing haunted everyone involved. The man had never explained himself. Not the why. Not the how. Not the moment when everything tipped from rejection into irrevocable harm. He had chosen silence over explanation, control over confession. Some believed it was cruelty. Others believed it was fear. Perhaps it was both. The detective reviewed the interview tapes one last time before archiving them. He paused at the moment where the man said he remembered her, where truth had nearly surfaced before being dragged back under. That was the closest the case had come to a voice from the past speaking in real time. Everything else had been echoes. Years from now, people would summarize the story in a sentence. Forgotten fingerprint. Sudden arrest. Cold case solved. They would miss the waiting. The years of nothing. The quiet erosion of hope. They would miss how fragile the solution had been, how easily it could have slipped away forever. In the evidence room, the envelope that once held the fingerprint was placed in permanent storage, now labeled with finality, no longer anonymous. It had done its work. It had waited longer than any witness ever could. Outside, life continued. Children who hadn't been born when she disappeared now walked the same streets, unaware of how close history had once brushed past them. Doors opened. Doors closed. Hands touched frames without a second thought. And somewhere between those ordinary motions, the story settled into its final shape, not as a mystery anymore, but as a warning. That time does not forgive. That silence is not safety. That even the smallest trace, left behind in a moment no one thought would matter, can one day rise up and demand to be heard. The night she vanished no longer belonged only to the dark. It belonged to the record, to the truth, to the long memory of a system that, when it finally aligned, proved that some crimes don't fade. They wait. Time moved differently after the verdict, as if the case had bent it slightly, slowed it in places, stretched it thin in others. The headlines faded first. They always do. Another story took their place, then another, but beneath that surface churn, the consequences of what had been uncovered continued to ripple outward, quiet but persistent. The police department changed in subtle ways. Evidence protocols tightened. Old cases were pulled from shelves with renewed seriousness. Detectives who once avoided cold files now volunteered for them, driven by the uncomfortable realization that resolution wasn't a matter of luck, but of attention. Somewhere, in some drawer, another envelope might be waiting. The fingerprint databases expanded again, fed by new arrests, new technology, new standards that promised fewer ghosts and more names. Analysts spoke about this case in training sessions, not with drama, but with precision, emphasizing patience, emphasizing humility. They reminded new recruits that the most important evidence is often the kind that doesn't scream. The town, too, learned something it hadn't expected. The man they'd passed on sidewalks, the one who blended into routines so seamlessly, had been hiding in plain sight. Trust recalibrated. Not collapsed, but sharpened. People became more aware of how little they truly know about the lives intersecting with their own. At the marina, a plaque appeared without fanfare. No speeches, just a name, a date, and a line about remembering those taken too soon. It faced the water. It caught the light in the late afternoon, when the heat softened and the air grew still. People paused there sometimes, even those who hadn't known her, sensing the weight of something larger than themselves. The detective retired the following year. Not because the case exhausted him, but because it felt like a punctuation mark he hadn't expected to earn. On his last day, he walked through the station one final time, past desks that hummed with new investigations, new urgencies. He stopped briefly outside the evidence room, resting his hand against the door, aware of how much of his career lived behind it. He didn't take the case with him. He left it where it belonged. Occasionally, letters arrived. From students. From families with their own missing. From people who said this story gave them permission to hope again. He answered some. Others he read quietly, understanding that hope, like truth, arrives on its own schedule. In prison, the man aged quickly. Isolation stripped away whatever confidence he'd once carried. He avoided interviews. Declined appeals hearings when his presence wasn't required. Guards reported he spent long hours staring at nothing, as if listening to something only he could hear. He never spoke her name again. Psychologists might call it guilt, or denial, or control maintained to the bitter end. The truth of it stayed locked inside him, inaccessible, unrecorded. Another absence layered onto the story. Years later, during a routine review, investigators confirmed what many had already suspected. The wetlands where fragments were found were not the final place. Evidence suggested movement, relocation, an attempt to erase and re-erase, driven by panic or calculation. The precise location of her remains would likely never be known. The family was informed gently. They received the news with a composure earned through decades of waiting. They said they had learned to live with uncertainty long ago. This, they said, changed nothing about what they knew in their bones. What mattered was that she had not been forgotten. Cold cases rarely end cleanly. They end in layers, in partial truths, in answers that satisfy the law but leave the heart restless. This one was no different. It had given up its central secret, but it kept others close, like a reminder that justice is not the same thing as completeness. As years passed, the story settled into archives, into documentaries, into whispered retellings that grew simpler with distance. Forgotten fingerprint. Sudden arrest. Solved. But those who lived it knew better. They knew how long the silence had lasted. How fragile the breakthrough had been. How easily the past could have stayed buried forever if not for a technician pausing, a database searching, a ridge of skin refusing to disappear. In that knowledge, there was something almost unsettlingly hopeful. Not because the outcome was good, but because it proved something fundamental. The past is patient, and when it finally speaks, it doesn't raise its voice. It waits for someone to listen. Long after the files were stamped closed, the case continued to exist in quieter places. Inside classrooms where it was dissected line by line, inside living rooms where documentaries played late at night, inside the private thoughts of people who had waited decades for a single sentence to be spoken aloud. We know who did this. But closure, as the family learned, was not a door that shut. It was a room you learned how to stand in. Some days it felt solid. Other days it echoed. They returned to the marina once a year, always on the same date, always without announcing it. They brought no flowers anymore. Just time. They stood together, watching the water move the way it always had, indifferent and eternal, and spoke about ordinary things. Jobs. Children. Small victories. They had learned that grief does not want ceremony, it wants continuity. The plaque weathered. Salt dulled the metal. The letters softened at the edges. And yet people still stopped. Some read it slowly. Others only glanced, sensing enough without knowing details. The place had absorbed the story into itself. In the police archives, the case became a reference point. Not famous, not flashy, but respected. A reminder written in margins and footnotes. Never assume the past is finished. When new technology arrived, when new databases went live, this was one of the examples shown to justify the effort. Proof that waiting was not the same as failing. A junior analyst, years later, would recognize the case number during training. They would feel a brief, strange pride, not in the crime, but in the persistence that outlasted it. They would go on to work other files. Some solved, some not, but the lesson stayed. The man in prison died quietly. No announcement. No media interest. A single paragraph buried deep in a local paper. There were no last-minute confessions, no dramatic reversals, no secrets finally surrendered. Just an ending as muted as the life he had tried to disappear into. His death changed nothing. The truth had already outlived him. What remained was her name, spoken more often now than it had been in decades. It appeared in articles, in captions, in the careful voices of narrators who understood that telling the story was not about spectacle, but about keeping memory intact. She was no longer just a victim. She was a presence. Cold cases are often described as sleeping. But this one had never slept. It waited. In paper. In plastic. In a single fingerprint pressed once, carelessly, and left behind without knowing it would become a witness. Time had tried to erase it. Failed. And that is the quiet truth beneath all cold cases. The thing that keeps investigators returning to shelves, to boxes, to dusted envelopes no one has opened in years. Silence is not absence. Somewhere in every unanswered case, the truth is still intact, unchanged, holding its shape, waiting for the moment when the world catches up to it. Because the past does not vanish. It endures. Even after the story was told, even after the final sentence faded from the screen and the credits rolled in silence, the case refused to fully loosen its grip. It lingered in the corners of conversation, in the pause that followed whenever someone said the words Florida, 1979, cold case. Not because of the arrest, not because of the fingerprint, but because of everything that had happened in the space between. Because decades had passed where the world moved forward and this truth stayed behind, untouched, unseen, waiting in darkness. In the town, newcomers arrived with no knowledge of what had once unfolded there. They bought houses. They jogged past the marina at sunrise. They raised children who learned to swim in the same waters, unaware that the surface they splashed in had once reflected flashing police lights. Time did what it always does. It covered things, softened edges, rewrote priorities. But not entirely. There were still locals who lowered their voices when the case was mentioned, even now. Still people who remembered the sound of helicopters that first night, the smell of fuel and salt in the air, the way rumors spread faster than facts. They remembered the shock not as a headline, but as a sensation, something physical, something that pressed against the chest and stayed there for years. Those people did not need reminders. They carried the case inside them. In law enforcement conferences, the story was retold with clinical precision. Dates, procedures, technology timelines. The forgotten fingerprint was presented as a triumph of persistence, a victory for databases and digitization. Slides changed. Applause followed. But behind the professional language was something unspoken, an acknowledgement of how easily the truth can be missed and how long consequences can last when it is. One retired detective admitted, quietly, that the case still bothered him. Not because it had gone cold, but because it had almost stayed that way forever. One oversight, one mislabeled envelope, one piece of evidence left waiting for a future that nearly never arrived. He said this to no one in particular, staring at a coffee cup gone cold. The victim's family moved forward in visible ways and invisible ones. Birthdays were celebrated. Milestones marked. Smiles returned, real ones. But there were moments, always unexpected, when the past resurfaced without warning. A familiar song. A photograph found in an old box. A question from a child too young to remember, asking why certain names were spoken with such care. They answered honestly. Not with details, but with truth. Some things happened. Some things took time to make right. Some scars do not vanish. They just become part of the body. And then there were the listeners. People who found the story years later, late at night, through headphones and dim screens. People who paused the narration, sat in silence, and felt a chill not from fear, but from recognition. Because this case was not unique. Because somewhere near them, maybe closer than they wanted to believe, there was another box on another shelf. Another fingerprint. Another name waiting. Cold cases create a strange intimacy. They invite strangers into unfinished rooms and ask them to sit with uncertainty. They remind us that justice is not a moment. It is a process stretched thin across time, dependent on patience, memory, and chance. And sometimes, on a single preserved ridge of skin pressed against glass. The forgotten fingerprint did not solve the case by itself. It waited to be noticed, to be believed, to be connected. It required human hands reaching back into the past, refusing to accept that the story had ended just because the noise around it had faded. That is what ultimately closed the case. Not technology alone. Not luck. But refusal. Refusal to let silence win. Refusal to let time rewrite what it had no right to change. And so the case ends where it always truly was. Not in a courtroom, not in a prison, not in an archive, but in the fragile space between memory and truth, where the past waits patiently, knowing that sooner or later someone will come looking. Because cold cases are never really cold. They are only unheard. And sometimes all it takes is one voice, one discovery, one moment of attention to make them speak again. Years later, when the headlines had thinned and the algorithm stopped pushing the story, the case settled into a different kind of life. No longer breaking news. No longer urgent. Just present. Like a scar you only notice when the light hits it right. In the town, the name resurfaced in unexpected ways. In a high school civics class. In a local newspaper anniversary column. In a casual conversation between two people who didn't realize they were standing on ground that once pulsed with fear. The words cold case still carried weight, even stripped of urgency, even spoken softly. They carried the idea that time can fail, but it can also correct itself. At the marina, nothing marked the exact place anymore. No tape. No cones. No officers. Boats came and went. Engines idled. Laughter bounced off the docks. The water reflected clouds instead of crime scene lights. But there were moments, early mornings, late evenings, when the quiet felt too intentional, as if the place remembered what it had once been asked to hold. People who knew the story never stayed long. In the courthouse, the file sat complete. Evidence logged. Verdict recorded. Appeals exhausted. It was clean now. Orderly. The kind of case administrators like. The kind that fits neatly into statistics about resolution rates and technological progress. But those who had worked it knew better. They knew how close it had come to remaining unfinished. How easily it could have slipped into permanent silence. One investigator, cleaning out a desk before retirement, paused over a photocopy of the fingerprint card. He remembered the first time he saw it. The moment recognition snapped into place, the sudden awareness that the past had just reached forward and grabbed the present by the collar. He almost threw the copy away. Almost. Then he folded it once and tucked it into a notebook he planned to keep. Some things you don't discard. The family stopped doing interviews. Not out of anger. Not out of exhaustion. Simply because the story no longer belonged to the public in the same way. It had done what it needed to do. It had been heard. Repeated. Understood. Now it could rest. But rest didn't mean disappearance. Every so often, someone new would discover the case and ask the same question everyone asked in the beginning. How could it take so long? How could a single fingerprint sit unnoticed for decades? How could a man live a full life while the truth waited in a box? There was never a satisfying answer. Because the truth is uncomfortable. Because systems are human. Because memory degrades. Because attention shifts. Because silence is easy and persistence is not. Because sometimes justice depends on timing, and timing does not care who it hurts. The case became a warning told quietly to new investigators. Not as a horror story, but as a responsibility. A reminder that evidence does not expire just because patience does. That every item logged has the potential to become a voice, if someone is willing to listen long enough. Cold cases teach a brutal lesson. The past does not need urgency to remain powerful. It only needs preservation. The fingerprint had survived humidity, neglect, relocations, budget cuts, changing leadership, and the slow erosion of institutional memory. It had waded through presidents, through recessions, through wars, through cultural shifts that reshaped the country around it. It did not age. It did not fade. It remained exactly what it had always been. Truth pressed into ink and paper. And when the world finally caught up, it spoke without hesitation. Some nights, people still searched the case online. They scrolled through timelines, read comments, not looking for answers anymore, but for reassurance. Proof that resolution is possible. Proof that some stories, no matter how delayed, do not end in ambiguity. Yet even in resolution, something remained unsettled. Because the years lost could not be returned. Because fear once planted does not uproot easily. Because knowing who did it does not undo what was done. The arrest closed the case. The impact did not. And that is the final echo of every cold case solved too late. The understanding that justice, even when it arrives, always carries a shadow. A reminder of time passed in silence, of voices unheard, of moments where the truth stood close enough to touch, and no one reached for it. The fingerprint had waited. Others still are. Long after the final paperwork was filed, the shadow of the case stretched into places no one expected. It showed up not as fear, but as caution. Doors locked a little sooner at night. Parents pausing an extra second before letting children wander too far down the docks. Not paranoia, memory. The kind that doesn't shout, only adjusts behavior quietly, permanently. The town never named it outright. Towns rarely do. They absorb tragedy the way wood absorbs water, swelling slightly, reshaping itself, never quite returning to the original form. New buildings rose. Old ones were painted over. But certain streets still carried reputations, passed along without explanation. People said things like, "I wouldn't walk there after dark," without remembering why they believed it. That was the real inheritance of the case. For investigators elsewhere, the story traveled farther than the crime ever had. It appeared in internal newsletters, in late-night conversations at conferences, in training rooms where instructors lowered their voices slightly when describing the decades-long gap between act and arrest. It became shorthand for a specific kind of failure and a specific kind of redemption. The Florida 79 fingerprint case. Everyone knew what that meant. It meant evidence overlooked, not destroyed. It meant a truth that survived not because it was protected, but because it was stubborn. It meant that sometimes the only difference between an unsolved mystery and a solved one was a person willing to look again without assuming they already knew the outcome. That lesson lodged itself deep. Some investigators carried it with them like a superstition. Before closing a case, they double-checked a box. Reran a query. Looked twice at something that seemed too small to matter. Not because they expected miracles, but because they had seen what neglect could cost. In this way, the case kept working long after it was done. The family felt the shadow differently. For them, it appeared in moments of unexpected calm, in laughter that arrived without guilt, in days where the loss did not dominate every thought. Those moments were disorienting at first, like stepping into sunlight after years indoors. They learned slowly that peace did not betray memory, that moving forward did not mean leaving her behind. They kept her name alive in ordinary ways. Stories told without drama. Anecdotes shared without tears. She became part of conversations again, not as an ending, but as a beginning, a sister, a daughter, a friend who had existed fully before becoming a case file. That was the victory no headline ever captured. Meanwhile, the public fascination shifted, as it always does. New cold cases emerged. New documentaries promised shocking twists and forgotten clues. Viewers moved on, chasing the next mystery. But some didn't. Some returned to this story repeatedly, unable to let go of the idea that something so small, a single fingerprint, could carry so much weight. They fixated not on the crime, but on the waiting. On the years where nothing happened. That waiting became the most unsettling part of the story. Not the violence, not the arrest, but the silence. The vast, empty stretch of time where answers existed, but remained unreachable, like a locked room everyone forgot was there. It forced an uncomfortable realization. How many other truths were already known, already recorded, already preserved, just not yet connected? That question lingered. In archives across the country, shelves remained full. Boxes labeled with fading ink. Evidence bags sealed with old tape. Items collected by hands long retired or buried. Each one a potential voice. Each one dependent on chance, attention, and refusal to let go. The Florida case did not guarantee resolution for them, but it proved possibility. And possibility is dangerous. It inspires persistence. It creates hope where resignation once lived. It makes silence feel temporary instead of final. That shift mattered. Years after the arrest, a young journalist reached out to the family, asking for permission to write a long-form piece. Not about the crime, but about the weight. About what it meant to live inside an unresolved story for decades, and what changed when resolution finally arrived. The family declined politely. Some stories, they felt, had already said enough. The journalist wrote it anyway, without names, without details, focusing instead on the idea of time as an accomplice and an enemy. Readers responded strongly. They recognized themselves in the waiting, in unanswered emails, unresolved griefs, unfinished conversations. The case became metaphor as much as history. That was another way it endured. The fingerprint itself was eventually moved. archived under climate control, digitized again at higher resolution. It became part of a teaching set, shown to students learning forensic basics. To them, it was just an image, lines and loops, an example. But instructors always paused before moving on. They told the story. They talked about how the print had been taken seriously, then forgotten, then rediscovered. How it had survived not because anyone planned for greatness, but because someone had followed procedure just well enough to preserve a chance. Procedure, it turned out, could be heroic in hindsight. Outside the classroom, life continued in ordinary rhythms. Seasons changed. Storms came and went. The marina weathered hurricanes and repairs. Each time, workers found older layers beneath newer ones. Old bolts, old boards, traces of what had been before. No one thought much of it. That was just how places worked. Layers upon layers. History did not disappear. It stacked. The case had become one of those layers now. No longer dominant, no longer raw, but still there. Felt underfoot, even if unseen. Sometimes, late at night, someone would stumble across the story by accident. A suggested video. A footnote link. A casual search that turned serious without warning. They would listen or read or watch and feel the familiar tightening in the chest. Not fear, but recognition. Because this story did not belong only to Florida. Or to 1979. Or to one victim, one suspect, one fingerprint. It belonged to the long human habit of leaving things unfinished, and the quieter, rarer habit of returning to them anyway. That was the shadow the case cast. Not darkness. Memory. And memory, once planted, does not fade easily. In the end, the case did not fade the way people expect stories to fade. There was no final moment where it gently slipped out of relevance, no clear line where attention ended and forgetting began. Instead, it thinned. It stretched. It became quieter without ever becoming gone. Like a sound heard through walls long after the source has stopped. The town carried on, as towns always do. Children who were not yet born when the crime happened grew up, left, came back. They inherited streets, routines, habits shaped by decisions made long before they understood why those decisions existed. Curfews that lingered. Caution taught without explanation. An unspoken understanding that some questions were better asked carefully. None of it felt dramatic. That was the strange part. The most powerful effect of the case was not fear, but subtlety. It trained people to live with the idea that certainty is fragile, that safety is provisional, that time can hide things without destroying them. Those lessons sank in quietly, shaping instincts rather than memories. In police departments far from Florida, someone would occasionally bring the case up during a late shift, usually when conversation drifted toward unsolved files. Someone would say, half joking, half serious, "Remember that fingerprint case?" Heads would nod. The implication needed no explanation. It was shorthand for patience, for humility, for the understanding that no matter how complete a file looks, it might still be lying. Those conversations ended without resolution, just a shared awareness that tomorrow's work mattered more than today's certainty. The victim's name appeared less often now. Fewer searches, fewer clicks. But when it did surface, it carried a different weight. Not shock, not urgency, respect. The kind reserved for stories that have already taught their lesson and no longer need to shout. The family noticed the change. They felt it in the way people spoke to them. Less curiosity, more care. Less fascination, more acknowledgement. The world had finally learned how to hold the story without trying to own it. That, too, was a kind of justice. They stopped marking the date publicly. No posts. No statements. The anniversary became private, folded into ordinary days. They learned that remembrance did not need witnesses. It only needed intention. Sometimes they spoke about her without mentioning the crime at all. They laughed. They argued about small details, what she would have thought about something, what choice she would have made. In those moments, she was no longer defined by the way her story ended, but by the way it had been lived. That was the reclamation no investigation could provide. Elsewhere, in climate-controlled rooms, evidence continued to rest. Boxes labeled, cataloged, stacked. Some would never be reopened. Others would, someday, be pulled back into the light by someone who did not yet know why they felt compelled to look again. The Florida case did not promise success. It promised responsibility. It stood as proof that answers can survive neglect, but only if someone eventually notices they are still there. That silence is not an eraser. It is a delay. That time does not forgive, it only waits. The fingerprint, once so insignificant, had done its work. It had spoken. It had been heard. It had changed the shape of the story forever. But it did not end the conversation. Because every cold case solved carries an unspoken twin. The cases that are still waiting. The ones without headlines. Without rediscovery. Without the luck of preservation and timing aligning just right. They sit now somewhere as the story ends. And that is the final echo of Florida 1979. Not the arrest, not the resolution, but the reminder that the past is never finished with us, no matter how much time passes, no matter how quiet it becomes. Some truths wait decades. Others are still waiting. And somewhere, in a box no one has opened yet, something is holding its shape, patient and intact, ready for the moment when someone decides that silence has lasted long enough.